Let's talk about a law with a bit of an identity crisis. We're looking at India's Domestic Violence Act. Now, this law was designed to do something really important: protect vulnerable people. It's meant to provide civil rights, like the right to live safely in your own home. But here's the twist. It uses the machinery of the criminal courts to do it. And that creates this huge paradox that has left lawyers and judges scratching their heads for years.
So that brings us to the core question, the one this is all about. Is a domestic violence case a civil matter, or is it a criminal one? And look, I know this might sound like some boring legal technicality, but trust me, the answer changes everything. It decides what kind of help someone can get, and get this, whether a high court can just stop a case dead in its tracks. It's a real legal mystery, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
So here's how we're going to crack this case. First, we'll dig into this legal identity crisis. Then, we'll play detective and look at the evidence for why these cases are civil, followed by the evidence for why they're criminal. After that, we get to the big reveal, the court's really clever solution, the quasi-criminal verdict. And finally, we'll wrap up with a very careful conclusion the court came to and why it matters so much.
All right, so this whole debate really exploded in the Gujarat High Court with the case of Usha Ben Mistry. This wasn't just some abstract argument. This was a real case that ended up exposing a massive split, a deep disagreement right inside the judiciary about how to handle this incredibly important law.
And here is the absolute heart of the matter. You see, the criminal code has a special section, Section 482, that gives high courts a kind of superpower to shut down a criminal case if it's being abused. So the huge question was, can they use this power on a domestic violence case? Well, if the case is civil, the answer is no. If it's criminal, the answer is yes. Everything was riding on that one distinction.
Okay, let's look at the first side of the argument. Exhibit A, the case for civil. This idea was really spelled out in a 2014 ruling from the Narendra Kumar case. And the court here took a very specific angle. They decided to focus not on the courtroom, but on the reason the law exists in the first place.
The judges in the Narendra Kumar case basically said, look, at its core, what is the Domestic Violence Act trying to do? It's trying to provide civil reliefs. The point isn't to punish someone by sending them to prison, it's to protect a person's basic civil rights.
And what are these civil rights? Well, we're talking about really fundamental stuff. The right to live in your family home, getting protection orders so you can be safe, financial support, even orders about child custody. The court also pointed out something interesting. The word offense barely even appears in these parts of the act. It's all about rights, not crimes.
Okay, so you think it's settled, right? Civil case. Well, not so fast. Because just 1 year later, in 2015, another judge in the very same court looked at this and came to the exact opposite conclusion. This was the Ramesh Bai case, and it completely flipped the script. It said, you can't just look at the what, you have to look at the how.
See, the Ramesh Bai ruling pointed to the nuts and bolts of the process. It said, hold on a second, these cases are heard by a criminal magistrate, and they operate under the Code of Criminal Procedure. The logic was pretty straightforward. If it walks like a criminal court and talks like a criminal court, well then it's under criminal jurisdiction.
And when you start listing it out, the argument for criminal gets pretty strong. The case goes to a criminal magistrate. The rulebook they use is the Criminal Procedure Code. If you want to appeal, you go to a criminal appellate court. The entire system from start to finish is built on a criminal law chassis.
So you see the problem, right? You've got this massive legal deadlock. One court, two completely opposite answers. One ruling says it's all civil because of the help it gives, so that special power to quash a case is off the table. The other says it's criminal because of the process it uses, which means that power is very much on the table. This just couldn't stand. Something had to be done.
This is where it gets really interesting. To break the tie, the case was sent up to a larger division bench, basically two judges whose job it was to look at both sides and come up with one final binding answer. They had to solve the mystery once and for all.
And their solution was just elegant. They came up with this brilliant concept, quasi-criminal. This was the big aha moment. They said a domestic violence case isn't one or the other. It's not purely civil or purely criminal. It's a hybrid. It is civil in its soul, the rights it's protecting, but it's criminal in its skeleton, the system it uses to do the protecting.
Here's a perfect way to think about it. Imagine you've got this precious cargo, the safety and rights of a family, and you need to get it somewhere fast. You could use a family minivan, right? Safe, reliable, but maybe a little slow. That's traditional civil law. Or
You could take that same precious cargo and strap it into a race car to get it there with speed and power. In this analogy, the civil reliefs are that precious cargo, and the criminal procedure, that's the race car's engine.
So the court's final verdict brilliantly brought both sides together. It said, yes, the reliefs, the things you're actually fighting for, are civil. But the machinery, the court system you're using, that's criminal. The genius was in seeing that these two aren't in conflict. They work together. The final verdict is a hybrid system, one designed to use the speed of the criminal system to deliver civil justice.
Okay, so quasi-criminal sounds cool, but what does it actually mean in the real world? The court wasn't just solving a puzzle for fun, it was trying to achieve a very, very delicate balance. How do you protect the vulnerable people this act was made for, while at the same time making sure the law can't be misused?
Which brings us right back to where we started. The big question. After all of that, can the High Court use its special power under Section 482 to stop a domestic violence case?
The court's answer was crystal clear. Yes, it can. Because the procedure has a criminal flavor, the tools of the criminal code are technically on the table. But, and this is probably the most important word in the entire ruling, that power has to be used with extreme caution.
And they didn't just say, be careful. They laid out some incredibly strict rules. To get a case squashed, you have to prove something huge, like a gross illegality, that the court has no business hearing the case at all. Or you have to prove a manifest abuse of process, that the whole thing is obviously fake or filed just to cause trouble. The court made it clear, the normal way to fight a case is through an appeal. This power to quash is the emergency button, the absolute last resort for only the most outrageous cases.
And this final quote from the court just sums up the whole philosophy. It says judges have to be slow and circumspect. In other words, incredibly careful before they even think about quashing one of these cases. And why? To protect the beneficial object of the act. At the end of the day, the number one goal is to protect victims. That's it.
What this all really shows us is how our justice system works at its best. Courts don't just read laws like instruction manuals. They interpret them. They breathe life into them to solve real-world problems. And in this case, the court did a masterful job of balancing two huge principles: the absolute need to protect vulnerable people and the equally important need to guard against the misuse of the law.
And that leaves us with this final, big question that's at the heart of so many protective laws. How do we make sure that a shield designed to protect people isn't misused as a sword? And how do we build in those safeguards without accidentally making the shield too weak to help the people who need it most? That, right there, is the constant, delicate balancing act of justice.